Hello, listeners of the podcast, which is called the Yavornitskiy Code. We're about to travel back in time to meet a prominent Ukrainian who devoted all of his life to restore the truth as to heroic past of Ukraine and to maintain the national spirit. The world knows Ukraine as the land of invincible warriors, and there is a historical root for that because Ukraine was famous for Zaporozhian Cossacks for centuries. So this podcast is about the person who brought back and maintained the memories about Ukrainian Cossacks. Dmytro Yavornitskiy is a historian, an archaeologist, an ethnographer, an author, a museum curator, a prominent public man, and a man of culture. He is widely known in historiography as the father of the Zaporozhian Cossacks. He was prosecuted by the Russian Empire, which annihilated the Cossacks. However, he didn't give up. He stood up for Ukraine, not with a sword, but with his knowledge. This podcast was made to celebrate the 170 years anniversary of the birth of Dmytro Yavornitskiy. This project is implemented by local and cultural society DIYA, that means activation, with the support of the Ukrainian Cultural Foundation. Media partner is D1 TV channel. He was born on the 6th of November 1855 in Kharkiv region, present-day eastern part of Ukraine. He was born to an impoverished noble family of a priest, a clergyman. This part of Ukraine was a part of Russian Empire back then, where Ukrainian language and Ukrainian culture were banned, and the historical information about Ukrainian Cossacks was concealed. However, the imperial bans couldn't destroy the historical memory. Zaporozhian Cossacks remained heroes in folk songs, legends, and folk tales. Dmytro Yavornitskiy grew up listening to those folk songs, legends, and folk tales. Even though he was born almost a century after the Zaporozhian siege was destroyed, he was keen on Cossacks from his early years, and that fascination became his life's work. He chose this topic for his scientific research when he studied at the Historical Philological Department at Kharkiv University. Yavornitskiy plunged into research. He traveled through former Zaporozhian Cossacks' lands, talked with Cossack descendants, wrote down memoir, studied archives, collected antiques, and carried out archaeological excavations. In addition, he delivered public lectures on Zaporozhian Cossacks in Kharkiv, and every time there was a full house, his lectures aroused a lot of interest. However, the university board notified Dmytro Yavornitskiy that topic on Zaporozhian Cossacks was unwelcome for regular historical studies. He was strongly advised to choose a different, safer research area. However, Yavornitskiy was enthusiastic about history of Zaporozhian Cossacks and refused to change the topic of research. For this reason, he was fired from the university and convicted as politically unreliable person. Despite pressure and prohibitions, he didn't betray his life's work. Dmytro Yavornitskiy devoted all of his life to studying Zaporozhian Cossacks' history. Not only he became the most prominent researcher of the history of Zaporozhian Cossacks, but also he extolled the Cossacks' publicity. Dmytro Yavornitskiy was persecuted both by Russian Empire and Soviet Union authorities. He was forbidden to teach, laid off his positions. His books were forbidden to publish. Moreover, Dmytro Yavornitskiy wasn't allowed to uphold his doctoral thesis. Notwithstanding all the impediments, he became an competent researcher during the following 20 years. He wrote hundreds of scientific articles, dozens of books, and finally managed to defend his doctoral thesis. In addition, he got lots of friends and numerous supporters and followers. Due to the constant political pressure, Dmytro Yavornitskiy had to change his abode and place of work, and even to live far away from Ukraine as his homeland for over 20 years. He lived in St. Petersburg, a capital of Russian Empire of that time. Then he lived in Tashkent and Samarkand, modern Uzbekistan. All those places were part of Russian Empire back then. Dmytro Yavornitskiy considered that period as exile. Later, he worked in Warsaw, which was under Imperial Russia, and then in Moscow, where he gave brilliant lectures at Moscow University. However, his long-time dream was to come back to Ukraine, and his dream came true in 1902 when almost 50-year-old Dmytro Yavornitskiy was invited to Katerinoslav, present-day Dnipro, Ukraine, a city in the central part of Ukraine. He was invited to be at the head of the newly formed historical museum due to his initiative. As of that time, the scientist lived and worked in Ukraine, where he was in charge of the museum for over 30 years. During that time, abundant museum collections were formed, especially collections of Zaporozhian Cossacks and ethnographic things. The Historic Museum in Katerinoslav became one of the most famous museums in Ukraine and was named after Dmytro Yavornitskiy after the death of the scientist. At present, it is National Historical Museum named after Dmytro Yavornitskiy in the city of Dnipro, Ukraine. Yet Dmytro Yavornitskiy was not only a historian, an archaeologist, an ethnographer, and a museologist. He was also a philologist, compiled a dictionary of Ukrainian languages, wrote poetry and narrative literature, took an active part both in cultural and public activities, gained his high prestige and great impact on society. He took part to establish the university in Katerinoslav, set up a Ukrainian studies department, and taught as a professor. In 1929, Dmytro Yavornitskiy became an academician at the Academy of Science and headed archaeological expeditions. However, in 1920s, when Soviet power established in the region, the scientist was under surveillance and had to go through difficult times again. In 1933, he was subjected to repression on the charge of nationalism. He was fired from the museum and other institutions. Despite that, Dmytro Yavornitskiy was not arrested like many other well-known Ukrainian activists. He was under constant surveillance, though. The scientist passed away on the 5th of August, 1940. Although the Historical Museum, which Dmytro Yavornitskiy had established and was in charge of for over 3 decades, was named after him, during Soviet time his books were not republished and his scientific heritage was hardly ever under study. Only after Ukraine gained its independence back, the name of Dmytro Yavornitskiy was back to its prominent position in history among the pantheon of outstanding Ukrainians. In our next Yavornitskiy Code podcast, we are going to tell you more about scientific cultural achievements of the scientist, including the story of his success despite wars, censorship, prohibitions, and repressions. Stay tuned.